The pie hit the ground before Emma Holloway even realized her hands were shaking. She stood in the middle of Charles Bailey's wheat field, the August sun hammering down on the back of her neck, and every single one of the 12 Harvest crew members had gone completely silent. They were staring at her, not at the shattered ceramic dish now leaking golden custard into the dark Kansas soil, not at the flaky, perfect crust that had taken her 3 hours to make that morning. They were staring at her face, and Emma knew exactly what expression she was wearing because she had practiced hiding it for 2 full years, and she had just in this moment failed completely. Charles Bailey was standing 20 feet away from her, his shirt dark with sweat, his jaw set like a man who had been hit and was deciding whether or not to hit back. His eyes were locked onto hers with an intensity that made her want to turn and run all the way back to the little house on the edge of the Holloway property and bolt the door and never come out again. Because he knew. She could see it in his face. Somehow, impossibly, Charles Bailey knew the secret she had carried since the day she buried her husband Robert in the rocky ground behind the church. And now he was looking at her the way a man looks at someone who has betrayed him. And Emma Holloway had not expected this, had not planned for this, and everything she had worked so carefully to protect was crumbling right along with that pie on the ground. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. His voice was low and very controlled, the kind of control that takes real effort. "I think you and I need to have a conversation." The Harvest crew was very carefully finding reasons to look elsewhere. Old Pete Dawson suddenly became fascinated by a row of wheat that needed no attention at all. The young Garner brothers from the next county over started discussing the state of their scythes in urgent, hushed tones. Even the dog that had been following the crew all morning quietly padded away into the tall stalks. Emma bent down and picked up what remained of the ceramic dish, pressing the broken halves together as if she could fix them by sheer force of will, and she thought, this is how secrets end. Not with a careful unraveling, not with a planned confession in a quiet room. They end in the middle of a wheat field in the summer heat, with pie on the ground and a man watching you like he has finally put every piece together. She had not wanted to love him. That was the truth she had been running from since the spring of 1882, when Charles Bailey had ridden up to the fence line of the Holloway property to return a stray calf, and she had opened the door of her house and seen him sitting on that horse in the late afternoon light, and something in her chest had moved that she had been absolutely certain was dead. Robert Holloway had died in the fall of 1880, thrown from a horse during a storm, and Emma had buried him and buried her heart along with him, and told herself that was simply how it was going to be from now on. She was 26 years old and she was a widow in Calvert County, Kansas, and she would run the 30 acres her husband had left her, and she would make a respectable life, and she would not be foolish enough to feel anything for anyone ever again. That plan had lasted precisely until Charles Bailey returned her calf. He had been new to the county then, having bought the old Prescott farm after old man Prescott died without heirs. The farm was larger than hers, nearly 200 acres, and Charles had a reputation already as a hard worker, a fair man, the kind of man who returned stray calves even when he had 1,000 things of his own to attend to. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled at the edges when it was damp and eyes that were a particular shade of brown that Emma had started thinking about in quiet moments and had to forcibly stop herself. He had been nothing but proper and neighborly. That was the thing about Charles Bailey. He was never forward, never presumptuous. He tipped his hat. He offered help when it was clearly needed and stepped back when it was not. He brought news from town when Emma could not make the trip. He fixed her fence once after a windstorm without her asking and left before she could even thank him properly. And Emma had responded to all of this by making herself harder to reach. She had smiled less. She had shortened her sentences. She had found reasons to be inside when he rode by. She had told herself this was wisdom and dignity and respect for her late husband's memory, and she had believed it for almost 2 years. Then the summer of 1882 arrived with a drought so severe that Emma's well had nearly run dry and her small wheat crop, the 30 acres that represented everything she had, was in serious danger of failing entirely. And Charles Bailey had done something that destroyed every careful wall she had built. He had diverted water from his own irrigation channel to her field, not told her about it, not asked for permission or payment or gratitude. Just done it quietly on a Tuesday night in early July, and Emma had woken up Wednesday morning to find her field showing moisture at the roots and walked the fence line, and found the small earthen channel he had dug by hand, and followed it all the way back to the boundary of the Prescott farm, and stood there in the early morning light with her hand over her mouth. She had wanted to be angry. It would have been so much easier to be angry. She had rehearsed the speech she would give him, something about charity and dignity and managing her own affairs. She had walked to his farm fully intending to deliver that speech and found him already in his east field at 6 in the morning, and when he had looked up and seen her expression, he had not gotten defensive or apologetic. He had simply said, "The drought is bad this year. It would be a shame for good wheat to die for lack of a channel." That was it. He had gone back to work. Emma had stood there with her prepared speech dissolving in her mouth and felt something shift in her chest that she absolutely could not afford to feel. She had gone home and made pie. It was the thing she did when she did not know what else to do. Robert had always said her pies were the best thing about living on the frontier. Her mother had taught her the recipe, a custard with a hint of nutmeg, a crust that required more butter than she could really afford but that she made anyway because some things were worth the cost. She made 4 of them. She wrapped them carefully in cloth. And she told herself she was simply being a good neighbor, making food for the harvest crew that Charles Bailey employed every August, men who worked from before sunrise to after sunset and needed to be fed, and there was absolutely nothing more to it than that. She carried those 4 pies across the fence line and into the wheat field, and that was the day Charles Bailey could not stop watching her move. She had not known it at first. She had set the pies down on the tailgate of the wagon that served as the crew's supply station, and she had spoken with old Pete Dawson, who she had known since childhood, and she had handed out portions and refilled tin cups from the water barrel she had also brought, and she had done all of this with the brisk efficiency of a woman performing a simple act of neighborly courtesy. But she had felt something, a particular quality of attention aimed at her from across the field. The way the air changes when someone is watching you, not casually, not the way the harvest crew watched her because she was a woman bringing food, but the way a person watches something that matters to them in a way they have not yet admitted out loud. She had looked up and met Charles Bailey's eyes, and he had not looked away. That was the moment. That exact moment, in the August heat with wheat dust on the air and the sound of men working in the distance. He had just looked at her, completely directly, and there had been nothing in his expression except honesty, and Emma Holloway had felt the last piece of the wall she had spent 2 years building simply stop existing. She had looked away first. She had packed up the empty dish and the water barrel and walked back to her own property with her spine absolutely straight and her face composed and her hands trembling all the way to the fence line. She had not slept that night, and she had made a terrible, fateful decision. She had decided to pretend it had not happened. She had decided that a widow with 30 acres and a dark past, and a secret she had never told a living soul, was not the kind of woman who got to fall in love again, and that whatever Charles Bailey's expression had contained in that unguarded moment was something she was going to ignore with every tool she had. The dark past was the real problem, the part she had never told anyone. Robert Holloway had not been a bad man. That was what made it complicated. He had been in most measurable ways a decent man. He had worked hard. He had not drunk to excess. He had never raised his hand to her. But Robert Holloway had made a series of financial decisions in the year before his death that had left Emma with a secret that could, in the wrong hands, destroy everything. Robert had borrowed money. Not from the bank in Calvert, where the records were formal and transparent, but from a man named Gerald Marsh, who operated a land speculation business out of Dodge City, and who was not the kind of creditor who accepted the death of a debtor as resolution of a debt. Robert had borrowed $400, which in 1880 was enough to buy a small farm outright, and he had used it to try to expand the Holloway acreage through a land purchase that had fallen through when the seller turned out not to actually own the land he was selling. The money was gone. Robert was gone. And Gerald Marsh's representative, a lean, quiet man named Calvin Dews, had come to the door of Emma's house 6 weeks after the funeral and explained to her, very politely, that the debt transferred with the property. Emma had $400 exactly nowhere. What she had was 30 acres of wheat land, a house, a small herd of cattle, and the utter conviction that she was not going to lose all of it to Gerald Marsh. She had spent the better part of 2 years quietly, methodically paying down that debt. She had sold cattle she could not really afford to sell. She had taken in sewing work from the women in town. She had reduced her own household expenses to something close to nothing. She had paid Calvin Dews in installments of $40 and $50 whenever she had them, watching the debt shrink with the grim satisfaction of someone dismantling a trap spring by spring. But she had told no one, because the shame of it was real and the fear was real, and because she had learned, watching her mother navigate widowhood in the hard years, that a woman with financial trouble on the frontier became a woman whom other people made decisions for. Well-meaning decisions, sometimes. Still not her own. She had been so close. By August of 1882, she owed Gerald Marsh $120. She had 80 of it set aside in the tin box under the floorboard in her bedroom. She needed 40 more, and she had 2 months before Calvin Dews came around again, and she had thought, she had genuinely believed, that she was going to navigate this to its end without anyone in Calvert County ever knowing about it. And then Charles Bailey had looked at her across the wheat field with that expression, and she had fallen in love with him despite everything, and she had tried to hide it, and she had failed. Because the second time she brought pie to the harvest crew, she had not been able to stop watching him either. He moved differently than Robert had. Robert had been compact and efficient, always the sense of a man conserving energy for later. Charles moved like someone who was completely present in the thing he was currently doing, big unhurried motions, full investment. And there was something about watching him walk between the rows of wheat with a bundle on his shoulder that Emma felt in her sternum in a way that was not at all appropriate and that she could not make stop. She had been watching him and thinking about him, and she had dropped the pie. And he had looked at her and he had said, "Mrs. Holloway, I think you and I need to have a conversation." Emma set the broken pieces of ceramic on the tailgate of the wagon and folded her hands in front of her and lifted her chin. "About what, Mr. Bailey?" He crossed the distance between them in long, measured strides, and when he stopped in front of her, he was close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the ones that came from squinting into the sun, and the set of his jaw that said he had been carrying something heavy for a while and had decided he was done carrying it alone. "About Calvin Dews," he said. The world got very quiet. Emma heard the wheat moving in the hot breeze. She heard the distant sound of men at work. She heard her own heartbeat, which had become suddenly very loud. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "Yes, you do." His voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something that sounded like anger and also sounded like worry, and Emma could not entirely separate the two. "I saw him at your door last month, Emma. Calvin Dews works for Gerald Marsh. I know who Gerald Marsh is. And I know what kind of men go to widows' doors in the evening and leave them looking the way you looked when he left." The use of her first name was involuntary, she could tell. It had come out of him naturally, the way things come out when the careful professional distance cracks, and it hung in the air between them. "It is not your concern," she said, and hated how her voice sounded. "It is my concern," he said, and something in his tone had changed. The controlled anger was still there, but underneath it now, undeniably, was something else, something that made the backs of Emma's knees feel unstable. "It is my concern because I would like it to be my concern if you would allow that. If you would just, for 1 minute, stop being so determined to handle everything alone." "I have managed fine," she said. "You have managed, yes." He reached up and took his hat off, which meant he was about to say something serious, and turned it in his hands. "You have managed the way a person manages when they are dragging a weight that is too heavy and they refuse to put it down because they think putting it down means admitting something. I know that particular kind of managing. I have done it myself." Emma stared at him. The harvest crew was very distant now, having found themselves things to do at the far end of the field. The silence between her and Charles Bailey had its own texture, thick and warm and terrifying. "How much?" he said. "I beg your pardon." "How much do you owe Gerald Marsh?" She almost said none of your business again. It was right there, ready. But something about the way he was standing there, hat in hand, eyes direct and without judgment, without pity, just steady and clear, made the word dissolve before it reached her mouth. $120, she said, and it was the first time she had said the number out loud to another living person, and it came out like a stone she had been holding in her chest for 2 years finally released. Charles was quiet for a moment. He put his hat back on. He looked at the ground and then back at her. "I have it," he said. "Absolutely not," Emma said immediately. "Emma." I said no. She took a breath and made her voice level. "Mr. Bailey, I appreciate the gesture, I do. But I am not a charity case, and I am not a woman who takes money from men. And if you press me on this, I am going to say something we will both regret." He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, something that moved through the frustration and landed somewhere else, somewhere softer and more complicated. "I am not offering it as charity," he said, and his voice was very quiet now. "I am offering it because I have been trying to figure out how to have a reason to talk to you that is not about borrowed calves or fence lines for the better part of a year, and this is apparently what I have ended up with, and I am aware that is not the most dignified position I have ever been in." Emma felt as though the ground under her feet had become slightly uncertain. "You fixed my fence," she said. "I was not going to charge you for that. You diverted your irrigation water to my field." "That was practical," he said, but the corner of his mouth moved slightly. "Mr. Bailey," Emma said and stopped. "Charles," he said. The word hung there between them. She looked at him, this man who had been her neighbor for a year and a half, who had returned her calf and fixed her fence and watered her wheat and was now standing in front of her with his hat on and his eyes entirely honest, offering her a way out of the trap she had been living in. "Charles," she said, and it sounded strange and right at the same time, the way a door sounds when it opens after being shut a long time. "I cannot take your money. You can pay me back," he said, "over time. At whatever pace. I am not Gerald Marsh. There is no interest, there is no deadline." He paused. "I'm not asking for anything in return except that you stop looking at me like I am a problem you are trying to solve." Emma made a sound that was almost a laugh and then stopped it because laughing felt like surrendering something, though she was no longer entirely sure what. "I do not look at you like a problem," she said. "You have been avoiding me for 3 months, he said, "since the last time you brought pie to the field." She said nothing because there was nothing true she could say that would help her case. "I noticed," he said. "I notice most things where you are concerned, Emma. That is the plain truth of it, and I am tired of pretending otherwise." The wheat moved around them. The sky was the particular blue of August in Kansas, that deep burnished blue that felt like it was pressing down on the earth. Emma looked at Charles Bailey and felt the full weight of the 2 years she had spent being careful and small and sealed off, and then she looked at him again and felt, underneath all of that, something warm and persistent and completely inconvenient. "You said you had done it yourself," she said. "The managing, the weight." He was quiet a moment. "My wife," he said, "Eleanor, she died of fever in the winter of '78. I had a farm in Missouri then. After she was gone, I sold it and came west because I thought geography might help." A pause. "It does not particularly help." "No," Emma said, "it does not." They looked at each other. "I would like to call on you," Charles said, "properly, if you are willing. After this business with Marsh is settled." Another pause. "I would like to do this in the right order." Emma thought about the right order. She thought about what it had cost her to keep everything in the wrong order for 2 years. All the careful distance and the hidden debt, and the pretending that watching him move through this wheat field did not do something to her that she could not name. She thought about the pie on the ground, the custard soaking into Kansas soil, and what it had taken out of her to drop it. "Come to the house on Sunday," she said. "I will make coffee." The look that moved across his face was brief but completely unguarded, and Emma thought she had never in her life seen anything quite like it. "Sunday," he said. "Yes." She picked up the rest of the broken ceramic, nodded once with what she hoped was dignity, and walked back toward the fence line. She did not look back, but she knew with absolute certainty that he was watching her go. And this time, for the first time in 2 years, she did not try to make herself smaller against that knowledge. She let it rest on her like sunlight. The following Monday morning, Emma rode into Calvert and deposited $40 she had taken from the tin box under the floorboard, and combined with $12 from her sewing money into a bank draft. She sent the draft to Calvin Dews at the address in Dodge City with a letter that said plainly she would have the remaining $80 to him no later than December 1st. She sealed the letter herself and handed it to the man at the post office counter, and walked back out into the bright morning feeling lighter than she had in 2 years. She had not taken Charles Bailey's money. She was going to do this on her own terms. But something about having told him the truth of it had cracked open the shell she had been living inside, and she found, to her surprise, that she could breathe in a way she had not been able to since the day Calvin Dews first came to her door. Sunday arrived with clouds on the western horizon that did not develop into anything serious, and a breeze off the plains that made the heat bearable. Emma swept her porch twice and told herself she was only doing it because the porch needed sweeping. She wore her good blue dress, the one with the white collar, and told herself that was simply because it was Sunday. Charles arrived at 10 in the morning on a bay horse, wearing a clean shirt and carrying his hat in his hand as he came up the porch steps, and Emma opened the door and looked at him standing there in the morning light and thought, "There you are," which was a strange thought to have about a man she had been studiously not thinking about for months, but which felt accurate. They drank coffee at her kitchen table, and it was awkward for approximately 15 minutes. The particular awkwardness of two people who are not quite sure yet how to be honest with each other without the framework of emergency. And then Emma asked him about Missouri, and he told her about a leaner, carefully, the way you tell someone about a grief that has been processed but not forgotten. And Emma told him about Robert, the good parts first and then the harder parts, the debt and the silence and the 2 years of managing alone, and Charles listened without interrupting, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, his eyes steady on her face. "You should have had someone to tell," he said when she was done. "I know that now," she said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about it. "Because I thought if people knew Robert had left me in that position, they would think less of him, and he was dead and could not defend himself. And because I was afraid if anyone knew about the debt, someone would decide I was not capable of managing and they would find a way to take the decision out of my hands." She looked at her coffee. "Women do not get to make many decisions on their own out here. I had learned to hold on to the ones I had." Charles was quiet for a moment. "That is fair," he said. "That is completely fair, and I want you to know that I am not offering to manage anything. I am not interested in taking decisions away from you. I am only interested in standing next to you while you make them." Emma looked up at him. "That is a very particular thing to say," she said. "I have been thinking about it for some time," he said. She felt her mouth curve. "How long have you been thinking about it?" he considered. "Since approximately 3 weeks after the calf incident. That was over a year ago." "Yes," he said. "I am aware. It has been a long year." Emma laughed, genuinely, and it felt like something unlocking, and she watched Charles Bailey's face when she laughed, and the expression there was so transparently pleased and warm that she had to look away from it because it was almost too much. They talked until noon and then past noon, and the clouds on the horizon came closer, and finally delivered a gentle rain that drummed on the roof and the porch and the garden. And they moved to the parlor and kept talking. And at some point the conversation stopped being the careful thing it had been at the kitchen table and became something easier and wider, ranging over everything from the drought politics of western Kansas to the books they had both read and the places they had each come from, and the particular solitude of running land alone. Charles left at 3 in the afternoon, just before the rain stopped, and stood on her porch with his hat finally on and looked at her with that direct, honest expression that she had spent 3 months trying to avoid. "Next Sunday," he said. "Yes," Emma said, "and bring something. I am tired of always being the one who provides the food." He smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, not the controlled half-smile she had seen in passing over the fence line, but an actual complete smile, and it was deeply unfair how good it looked on him. "I can make biscuits," he said. "I will believe it when I see it," she said. He tipped his hat and walked to his horse in the drizzling rain, and Emma stood on her porch and watched him go and did not try to stop herself. The Sundays became a rhythm. He brought biscuits the second week, and they were good, and Emma told him so with the directness that she suspected had been one of the things keeping men at a careful distance from her, but which Charles seemed to find entirely acceptable. He brought news from town. He brought a copy of a novel he thought she might like and was right. She cooked dinner one Sunday in October, and it rained again, and he stayed until the evening, and they sat on the porch after eating and watched the Kansas sky change colors, and Emma thought, this is what it was supposed to feel like. Not the desperate, urgent thing she had felt at 22 when she married Robert, that particular young person urgency of needing to be settled and safe. This was something else. This was the feeling of finding something you had not known was missing until it was right in front of you. In November, Calvin Dews came to her door for the last time. Emma answered with $80 in cash and a receipt book, and watched him write the final entry in the debt ledger with the particular satisfaction of a person watching a chapter close. When he left, she stood in her kitchen for a long time, very still, and then she went to the parlor and sat down and allowed herself to feel it, the full, clean weight of being free of it. She told Charles that Sunday. She told him the debt was paid in full, and she had done it herself, and she watched his face and saw the pride there. Not the kind that was about him, but the kind that was about her. And something about that expression undid her more thoroughly than anything else he had done or said. "I know," he said. "You know. Calvin Dews passed through Calvert on his way north 2 weeks ago. He stopped at the general store. He mentioned in passing that the Holloway debt was settled." He paused. He seemed slightly annoyed about it. "I think he expected you to need more time." Emma stared at him. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because it was your news to tell. I was going to wait until you were ready." She looked at him for a long time. The fire in the parlor hearth was doing its steady work. The Kansas winter pressed at the windows. Charles Bailey sat in the chair across from her with his large hands easy on the armrests and his eyes on her face, and Emma thought about 2 years of carrying things alone, and then thought about what it felt like to have someone who waited for you to be ready. "Charles," she said. "Emma, I would like you to stop calling on me in the formal sense," she said. He was very still. "I would like you to call on me in whatever sense comes after the formal sense," she said. "I am 30 years old, and I am not interested in being cautious any longer." He rose from the chair slowly and crossed the parlor and stood in front of her and looked at her with that expression she had first seen across the wheat field, the honest, unguarded one, and then he reached out and took her hand in both of his, which were warm and rough from work, and held it. "I was going to ask you to marry me at Christmas," he said. "I had it planned." "It is November," Emma said. "I am asking you to skip some steps." "You are asking me," he said, and the corner of his mouth was doing the thing again. "I am suggesting strongly," Emma said, "in a direction." He raised her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, brief and deliberate, and Emma felt it everywhere. "I would very much like to marry you, Emma Holloway," he said against her hand. "Good," she said. "That is very good." They were married in December of 1882, on a day when the sky was white with the threat of snow, and the church in Calvert was strung with cedar boughs, and the whole congregation had come out, because Charles Bailey was well liked, and Emma Holloway had been a subject of interested speculation for 2 years, and people were glad to see it resolved. Old Pete Dawson sat in the front pew and cried openly, which he explained afterward was due to the cold air, and nobody believed him, and he didn't care. The Garner brothers, who had been present at the wheat field when everything began, attended in their best shirts and looked pleased with themselves in the way of men who feel they have been present at the beginning of something. Emma wore her good blue dress again, the one with the white collar, because the dress had served her well. Charles wore a new shirt he had purchased specifically, dark wool, and he stood at the front of the church and watched Emma walk down the aisle with the expression of a man who has been very patient for a very long time and has just been given an answer he had begun to wonder about. Reverend Hutchins performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who had married a great many prairie couples and knew the weather was not to be trusted. And when Charles took Emma's hands at the altar and looked at her, he said the words not by rote, but with a seriousness that made several of the women in the pews reach for handkerchiefs. Emma said her own words back and held his gaze and thought, "2 years ago I was standing in a field with a pie, trying not to feel this, and here I am feeling it anyway, and it is the best failure I have ever had." After the ceremony they had a celebration at the church hall with food contributed by half the county, because that was how things were done, and Emma ate more than she had eaten at a single sitting in years. And Charles stood next to her the entire evening with her hand in his, and introduced her to people as his wife in a tone that suggested he was still finding the words slightly astonishing and enormously satisfying. They drove back to the Bailey farm in the early evening, the white sky finally making good on its promise with a light snow that settled on everything and made the world quiet. Emma sat beside Charles on the wagon seat with his arm around her shoulders against the cold and looked at the flat white Kansas landscape and thought, "I am home." Not in the way that meant a place, in the way that meant a person. The Bailey farmhouse was larger than the Holloway house, and Charles had spent the previous 2 weeks getting it ready, which Emma discovered meant he had cleaned it very thoroughly and put new curtains in the parlor that he had bought at the general store, and which were slightly crooked, and which she loved immediately. He had also stocked the kitchen with more provisions than 2 people could reasonably eat in a month, which she suspected was his way of saying he had thought about this in detail. "The curtains are crooked," she said. "I know," he said. "I tried twice. I can fix them." "I thought you might say that," he said, and looked genuinely relieved. Emma fixed the curtains that evening and Charles built up the fire and they sat together in the parlor of the house that was now hers as well, and the snow fell outside the windows, and it was the quietest and most complete evening Emma could remember. The spring came, and with it, the work of 2 farms being managed as one operation. Emma had kept the Holloway property, leasing the land to a young couple newly arrived from Ohio, and the income from the lease was steady enough to offset the additional expenses of the Bailey Farms expansion. Charles had plans for the land, careful plans, the kind that came from a man who thought in years rather than seasons, and Emma found herself drawn into these plans with an engagement that surprised her, contributing ideas about crop rotation and cattle management that she had been accumulating in solitude for 2 years, and that Charles received with the seriousness they deserved. This was the thing about Charles Bailey that she had not entirely understood until she was living alongside him every day. He listened, not in the way that some men listened, with a look of patient waiting for you to finish so they could explain what they already thought. He listened and changed his position when he encountered a better argument, and told her when she was right, and told her when he disagreed, and they argued once in April about the timing of the spring planting with a vigor that left them both slightly flushed, and resulted in a compromise that Emma later admitted in private was probably correct. They had found a rhythm. The rhythm of two people who had each been alone long enough to know themselves, now navigating the particular complex territory of being together. In June, Emma discovered she was pregnant. She told Charles on a Tuesday evening after supper, standing in the kitchen with the dishes still on the table, because she had been carrying the news since morning and had not been able to hold it any longer, and there was never going to be a perfect moment. He went very still. Then he looked at her with something in his face that she could only describe as enormous, something that did not fit in ordinary expression. "Are you certain?" he said. "Yes," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was almost comical given his size, and looked at her for a long moment, and then pulled her close and held her. Just held her, with his hand in her hair and his chin on her head, and Emma felt his chest expand on a long, slow breath that she thought might contain everything he could not put into words just then. "Good," he said, finally, quietly into her hair. "That is very, very good." The summer of 1883 was easier than the one before it. The drought that had battered the county the previous year had lifted enough for a decent wheat harvest, and Charles had the irrigation channel now fully developed across the property line, both properties benefiting from the system he had extended over the winter. The Holloway acreage under the young Ohio couple was producing well, and Emma found, to her own surprise, a satisfaction in the wider management of it all that she had not been able to feel when she was managing 30 acres alone under the weight of a secret debt. The harvest crew arrived in August, same as always, with old Pete Dawson and the Garner brothers among them, and Emma made 4 custard pies and carried them to the field. She was visibly pregnant by then, 7 months along, and old Pete Dawson nearly fell off the wagon tailgate in his anxious helpfulness, insisting on carrying the water barrel and adjusting the shade cloth, and generally performing the function of a grandmother hen in a man's body, which Emma endured with affection. She was handing out portions at the tailgate when she heard the particular quality of quiet that meant something had shifted in the field, and she looked up and saw Charles standing 20 feet away watching her with the exact expression he had worn the first time she brought pie to this field, that honest, unguarded particular attention that had started everything. One of the Garner brothers noticed and nudged the other, and there was a brief exchange of looks among the crew that Emma was not supposed to see, and that she saw perfectly well. Charles crossed the field to her and picked up the water barrel himself, and set it in the wagon because she should not be lifting it, and then he stood beside her in the August wheat field, both of them looking out at the golden rose and the white sky and the dust of the work. And Emma thought about the pie on the ground a year ago, and the secret, and the 2 years before that, and the distance she had worked so hard to maintain, and marveled at how thoroughly a person could be wrong about what they needed. "Still watching you move through the field," he said quietly. "I know," she said. He put his hand on her back low, where the weight of the pregnancy was making itself known, a steady warm pressure, and Emma leaned into it slightly, and old Pete Dawson looked over with an expression of such beatific satisfaction that she had to pretend to be interested in the pie tin to avoid smiling. Their son was born in October of 1883, during a cold snap that had frost on the windows and a fire blazing in the bedroom, and Emma labored through it with Mrs. Hutchins, the Reverend's wife, in attendance, and Charles outside the bedroom door, which was the custom, and which he found entirely insufficient and made known to Mrs. Hutchins through the door twice, and to Emma's private amusement. The baby arrived at 4 in the morning, healthy and loud, with a full head of dark hair that he had clearly gotten from his father and Emma's mother's blue-gray eyes, and when Mrs. Hutchins opened the bedroom door to allow Charles in, He came through it with a speed that suggested he had been pressed against it for some time. He sat on the edge of the bed and Emma put the baby in his arms, and Charles Bailey, who had been steady and controlled and capable in every situation she had seen him in, looked down at his son, and his face did something that Emma was fairly certain she would remember for the rest of her life. "William," Charles said, because they had decided on names in September. William Robert Bailey, after Charles's father and Emma's husband, because the past was part of both of them and that was all right. "William," Emma confirmed from the pillow, exhausted and clear-eyed and more at peace than she had felt in 5 years. Charles looked at her over the baby's head and his expression had that quality again, the one that did not fit in ordinary expression, and he said, "Thank you," in a voice that meant more than 2 words could contain. "Thank you back," Emma said. He laughed, soft so as not to alarm the baby, and leaned down and kissed her forehead. William proved to be a child of enormous opinions and very early walking, taking his first independent steps at 10 months in the kitchen of the Bailey farmhouse, and proceeding directly to a chair he wished to climb, which Charles caught him attempting 3 times before noon, and which Emma thought was the most clarifying preview of the child's personality she had yet encountered. He was bright and persistent, and had his mother's stubbornness, and his father's patience in some mixture that suggested interesting years ahead. In the spring of 1884, Charles rode into Calvert for supplies and came home with news that Gerald Marsh had declared bankruptcy and that Calvin Dews had apparently moved to Colorado. Emma received this information with the feeling of a storm that passed without hitting, the particular gratitude of an avoided thing, and went back to the bread she was making without particular ceremony, because there was nothing left of that chapter to mark. But she marked it internally. She marked it as the last thread of the old life, fully cut, and felt the ground under her feet become completely solid. The Ohio couple who had been leasing the Holloway acreage, a young man named Thomas Porter and his wife Jane, approached Charles and Emma in the summer of 1884 about the possibility of purchasing the land. They were good tenants and had improved the soil and the fence lines and had built a small barn, and they clearly loved the land with the particular love of people who had arrived somewhere and recognized it as home. Emma and Charles discussed it over 2 evenings at the kitchen table, William asleep in the next room. The kind of discussion that felt like exactly what Charles had described that day in the wheat field, standing next to each other while decisions were made. They sold the Holloway acreage to the Porters at a fair price in September of 1884, and the money went into the Bailey farm's future, into equipment and seed, and the new irrigation extension Charles had been planning. And when Emma signed the deed transfer, she thought about her mother, and about the 30 acres, and about everything that ground had held, and felt proud of it, and let it go. What she had not let go of was the name Holloway entirely. She was Emma Bailey now in every practical and legal sense, but she had been Emma Holloway long enough that it was part of her, and Charles had never asked her to excise it, had always said her history was not separate from her. It was her, and she loved him for that. The winter of 1884 brought the worst blizzard Calvert County had seen in a decade. 3 days of whiteout that drove the snow through every crack and kept them inside with William and the fire, and enough provisions from a well-managed larder to be genuinely comfortable, which Emma considered vindication of her very strongly held opinion that the larder should always be overstocked. Charles taught William, who was 14 months old and had absolutely no capacity for the information, how to play cards, dealing out hands to the toddler with complete seriousness, while Emma sat across the kitchen table mending and trying not to laugh. William ate 2 of the cards and sat on a third, and regarded the whole enterprise with the expression of someone who was being humored by adults in a way he found moderately interesting. They were snowbound for 3 days, and Emma did not mind a single hour of it. By the spring of 1885, the Bailey farm had become something notable in the county, not the largest operation by any means, but one with a reputation for being run well and equitably. Charles being the kind of employer who paid fair wages and treated his crew with consistent respect, and Emma being known now as a woman of considerable capability, who was also the source of the best custard pie in the county. A reputation she had arrived at entirely by accident, and now maintained with some deliberateness. She taught the recipe to Jane Porter that spring, the young woman from the Holloway acreage who had become a genuine friend, sitting in Jane's kitchen with William playing on the floor and Jane's infant daughter, just 3 months old, sleeping in the cradle, and explaining the particular ratio of butter in the crust that made the difference and the nutmeg, always the nutmeg. And Jane wrote it all down in her own recipe book, and Emma thought about her mother teaching her and felt the continuity of it like a thread. In the summer of 1885, Emma was pregnant again. She told Charles in the evening on the porch, the way she had told him the first time, not saving it for a particular moment but simply when she could not hold it any more. He was sitting in the chair beside hers looking out at the field, the last light of the day on everything, and she said, "We are going to have another baby." And he turned to look at her with the same enormous expression, slightly refined now by practice but not diminished at all. "When?" he said. "February, I think." He reached across and took her hand, and they sat together on the porch in the summer evening, and the field was gold with approaching harvest, and William was inside asleep, and the whole future was sitting right there on the porch with them, quiet and large and deeply satisfying. The second baby was a daughter. She arrived in February of 1886 during a cold snap that was gentler than the previous years, and Mrs. Hutchins attended again, and Charles was outside the door again, and Emma labored with the particular efficiency of a second birth, and produced a child who was quieter in her arrival than William had been, but who looked up at the world from the moment of her birth with eyes of extraordinary alertness, as though she had arrived with an agenda. They named her Clara, after Charles's mother, Eleanor Clara Eleanor Bailey. She had Emma's coloring and Charles's directness, and it was clear from the first weeks of her life that she and William were going to have a relationship of collaborative chaos, which began to manifest fully around the time Clara achieved mobility. Old Pete Dawson, who had by this point been coming around on Sunday afternoons regularly enough that William called him Pete and Clara regarded him as a fixture of the household, attended the baptism, and cried again and again, blamed the weather. The summer of 1886 brought the harvest crew back to the Bailey fields, larger now than they had been in 1882 because the farm had expanded, and Emma brought pies to the field again on a Tuesday afternoon, William walking beside her with his own small tin and Clara on her hip. Charles saw her coming from across the field. He stopped working. He watched her move through the rows with William trotting beside her, Clara held easy on one hip, the pie basket on her other arm, the sun on her hair which she had stopped wearing quite as severely as she once had, and he watched her with the exact expression he had worn 4 years ago when everything began, that honest, unguarded attention, and if anything it was deeper now because it knew what it was watching. She reached him and put Clara down on his arm because he always took Clara when Emma was carrying things, which was a division of labor they had arrived at without discussion, and she set the basket down on the wagon tailgate and started cutting portions for the crew. "You are doing it again," she said without looking up. "I know," he said, watching me move through the field. "Yes." She looked up at him then with an expression that she had stopped trying to hide a long time ago, that particular expression she was quite certain only his face produced in her. "You could help instead of watching," she said. "I could," he agreed, and shifted Clara to his other arm and came to stand beside her at the wagon, cutting portions, handing them out, doing the work alongside her, which was what he had been doing for the past 4 years, and which he intended to keep doing for the rest of his life. Old Pete Dawson came up for his portion and looked at the two of them and Clara on Charles's arm and William, already investigating the contents of the basket with unauthorized enthusiasm, and Pete took his pie and shook his head with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to see something come out right. "Good pie," he said to Emma. "Thank you, Pete," Emma said. "Good pie every year," he said, with a significance that had nothing to do with pastry. Emma looked at Charles over Clara's head, and Charles looked back at her, and there was an entire conversation in that exchange. 4 years of Sundays and storms and arguments and laughter and 2 children and one long-resolved secret and a dropped pie in a wheat field and a man who had not looked away. "Yes," Emma said to Pete, still looking at Charles. "It gets better every year." The autumn of 1886 brought changes to Calvert County that were larger than any single farm. The railroad that had been rumored for years finally confirmed its route, and the nearest spur would pass within 12 miles of the county, which meant access to markets that had previously been accessible only by the long cattle drive north or the wagon haul to the main line further east. The farmers of the county gathered at the church hall in October to discuss the implications, and it was a meeting that stretched 3 hours longer than intended because the implications were considerable. Charles had thoughts about it, careful, measured ones, and Emma had different thoughts, sharper ones about the risk of over-reliance on rail prices and the way Eastern market buyers had treated smaller producers elsewhere. And they contributed both sets of thoughts to the meeting, with the result that several other farmers who had been uncertain about how to feel about the railroad found themselves with a clearer framework. Thomas Porter from the old Holloway acreage leaned over to his wife Jane during the meeting and whispered something, and Jane nodded, and later she told Emma that Thomas had said, "Those two are going to be the people everyone in this county talks to when they do not know what to think," which Emma relayed to Charles, and which he received with the private satisfaction of a man who had always hoped to be useful. The winter of 1886 was mild enough that Charles undertook the barn expansion he had been planning. Adding a section that would accommodate the larger herd he intended to build through the next spring's purchasing. He worked with a carpenter from town, a man named Ezra Cole, who had worked all over the county and who had the opinion, shared widely, that Charles Bailey built things to last. Emma spent that winter doing something she had been thinking about since William was born. She wrote down everything she knew about managing land in western Kansas, all the things she had learned in the years of running the Holloway acreage alone, the things about soil and water and crop rotation, and when to hold cattle, and when to sell them, and how to read the weather signs that the old-timers knew. And she wrote it in a plain, clear hand in a series of ledger books, not for publication, just to have it written somewhere. Because knowledge lived in people out here, and when people died the knowledge went with them, and that seemed to her like a waste. Charles found her at the kitchen table one February evening surrounded by ledger books and asked what she was doing, and she told him, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Can I add to it? There are things I know about the Eastern Quarter soil that are probably worth writing down." So they wrote it together. 2 voices, 2 sets of knowledge, 2 sets of mistakes and recoveries and discoveries about this particular piece of Kansas ground, set down in the ledger books that lived from then on in the drawer of the kitchen table, where anyone who needed them could find them. The spring of 1887 brought more than the usual run of events. It brought a family named Alderson from Tennessee, 5 of them, who had taken up the old Garner property 2 counties over, and who rode into Calvert looking uncertain about everything, and who Emma met at the general store on a Wednesday, and who she invited home for supper, because they had 3 young children and the look of people who had made a very large decision, and were not entirely sure they had survived it yet. Charles came in from the field to find a Tennessee family at his dinner table, accepted this with the equanimity of a man who had learned that Emma's hospitality was a force of nature rather than a planned event, and sat down and talked farming with James Alderson for the better part of 3 hours, while their wives compared methods of putting up preserves, and the children of both families introduced themselves to chaos in the yard. The Aldersons became friends. This was how things worked in the county, the long geography of it. Neighbors who might be 3 miles away feeling closer than neighbors who lived in city blocks, knit together by the shared enterprise of the land. By the summer of 1887, Emma realized she was pregnant for the third time. She told Charles on the porch again, in the same chair in the same evening light, and he looked at her with the same expression, which had a slight additional quality now that she thought of as contentment layered over joy, the kind that comes from knowing the shape of a happiness before it arrives. "Are we going to keep doing this?" she said. "I am very much in favor of continuing to do this," he said. "You would be," she said, and he laughed and reached for her hand, and they sat in the evening, until William came out to request an arbitration in a dispute with Clara about the ownership of a particularly important stick, and they attended to that with the judicial gravity it deserved. The third child was another son, born in February of 1888, arriving in the coldest week of the year with a dispatch that suggested he had been informed of the available accommodations and approved. They named him James, after Charles's younger brother who had stayed in Missouri and who they had not seen in 3 years, and who Charles wrote regularly with the persistent hope of a man who believes family should be kept. James arrived with Clara's alertness and William's noise combined into a single small person, and his siblings' reactions were instructive. William took one look at the baby and announced his intention to teach him things, which Emma thought was simultaneously touching and alarming, given what William considered worth knowing. Clara regarded the new arrival with the expression of a scientist encountering an interesting specimen, and proceeded to conduct several non-invasive investigations of the infant that required monitoring. By the summer of 1888, the Bailey farm had become the operation Charles had planned for in those first years, the irrigation system fully extended, the herd grown to a size that required 2 full-time hands in addition to seasonal crew, the wheat yield consistent and strong. They had weathered drought and blizzard and market fluctuations, and the particular financial tightening of 1885, when Eastern buyers had driven down grain prices, and a number of farms in the county had changed hands under difficult circumstances. None of the farms that had been managed by people who came to the Bailey kitchen table with their questions, and their numbers had changed hands against the owner's will. Emma had not set out to be a resource in that way, but had found herself becoming one, and Charles had observed this with no surprise whatsoever and made sure the coffee was always made. Old Pete Dawson retired from harvest work in the fall of 1888, his joints having reached a consensus with the Kansas whether that the seasonal labor was done. He moved to a smaller place on the edge of Calvert Town, and Emma brought him pie the following Sunday, not harvest pie but Sunday pie, the kind she made for people she cared about, and she sat at his kitchen table and drank coffee with him and let him tell her about the old days of the county, the days before she had arrived, the days before Charles had arrived, when the prairie had been something else entirely. "This land changes people," Pete said, "mostly for the worse, grinds them down. But sometimes it makes them into what they were supposed to be." "Which kind were we?" Emma said. "Second kind," Pete said without hesitation. "Both of you, second kind." The harvest of 1889 was the biggest in the Bailey farm's history. The wheat was tall and the yield was 40 bushels to the acre on the best ground, which was numbers that made the county agent's eyes widen when he came through in August doing his tally. Charles worked alongside the crew with the same commitment he had brought to every harvest since Emma had known him, which was the thing she had always loved about it, that he was not the kind of man who managed from a distance. Emma brought 4 pies to the field on the Tuesday of harvest week, just as she had every August since 1882. William was 6 now and had opinions about whether he was old enough to help with the harvest, which he absolutely was not, and had negotiated with his father for the right to carry the water bucket, which he did with immense seriousness. Clara, 5 years old, had declared herself in charge of the pie basket, and carried it with the focus of someone who understood the importance of the mission. James, toddling on Emma's hand, was simply glad to be wherever everyone else was. Emma set the pies on the wagon tailgate, and William set down the water bucket with great care, and Clara supervised the cutting with an eye that suggested she had been watching her mother perform this task for her entire cognizant life, and had notes. Charles came across the field. He moved the same way he always had, those unhurried, purposeful strides, and Emma watched him come through the rows of wheat toward her, and felt the thing in her chest that she had felt the first time and the second time and every time since. That warm, persistent, inconvenient thing that had turned out not to be inconvenient at all. Just true. He reached her and put his hand on her face briefly in the manner of a man who has been in the sun all morning and is encountering something he is glad of, and she leaned into it for a moment. "Good harvest," she said. "Very good," he agreed. He picked up James, who had been demanding elevation, and settled the toddler on his shoulder. "The north field will be done by Thursday." "I will make more pie for Thursday," Emma said. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I want to," she said, which was entirely true. She had brought pie to this harvest crew every August for 7 years now, not out of obligation or neighborly duty or any of the reasons she had told herself the first time, but because this field and this crew and this man in it were hers and she was theirs, and she wanted to be present in the thing she loved. Old Pete Dawson was not with the crew anymore, but he had sent word that he would come on Thursday when the north field was done, to see the finish of it, because some things you come back for. Charles looked at Emma across the wagon tailgate with the noise of the harvest crew around them, and the Kansas sky enormous overhead, and 3 children in various stages of occupying the afternoon. And he looked at her with that expression that had not changed since the first time. And Emma thought about how she had dropped the pie, and how his eyes had not looked away, and how she had walked back across the fence line with her spine straight and her hands shaking, trying to contain something that had refused, finally, to be contained. "Thank you for bringing pie," he said, which was not about pie at all. "Thank you for watching," she said, which was not about watching. Clara looked up from her very official supervision of the pie distribution and regarded her parents with the expression of a 5-year-old who has decided adults are doing something she cannot yet fully classify. "You are doing the looking thing again," Clara said to her father. "You always do the looking thing at Mama at the field." William looked up from his water bucket diplomacy. "They do that a lot," he confirmed, in the tone of someone who has been observing this phenomenon for years. Charles looked at Emma, and Emma looked at Charles, and they were both trying not to smile with the full effort of 2 people who had learned that smiling at each other in front of the children resulted in commentary. "I look at your mother," Charles said to Clara, with the seriousness the subject deserved, "because she is the most remarkable person I know, and it is worth looking at remarkable people when you have the good fortune to be near them." Clara appeared to file this answer for later consideration. William nodded as though the explanation was satisfying, in a way that resolved a long-standing question. James, on Charles's shoulder, appeared to endorse the general sentiment by grabbing a fistful of his father's hair and leaning sideways to look at Emma with an expression of cheerful agreement. Emma felt the autumn light on her face and the wheat smell on the air and her children around her, and Charles's hand steady at her back, and she thought about a woman in a field 4 years before this and 7 years before this and every August between, a woman who had been carrying secrets and running from warmth and telling herself that sealed off was the same as safe. She had been so wrong. She had been gloriously, completely, wonderfully wrong. The harvest was finished on Thursday, and old Pete Dawson came out to see the finish of it, just as he had said he would. He sat on the tailgate of the wagon and ate his pie and watched the last of the wheat come in, and then he looked around at the Bailey farm, at the expanded barn and the irrigation channels and the good fence lines and the house with curtains in the windows, and he nodded the way old men nod at things that have come out right. Emma sat beside him on the tailgate, and they watched Charles walk the finished field in the late afternoon light, checking the cut the way a man checks a thing he has done well and wants to confirm fully done. He never stops watching you either, Pete said. I know, Emma said. Good, Pete said. That is exactly how it should be. The light moved across the field. Charles turned and found Emma where she was, the way he always found her, and the expression he wore across that distance was the same one she had seen the first time in the same field in the same August light, and it would never, not once, not a single time, get ordinary. She waved. He lifted his hand in return. Around her, the wheat field of the Bailey farm settled into the quiet of finished work, and the Kansas sky deepened toward evening, and Pete Dawson ate his pie and the children ran between the rows, and somewhere very close to here was a woman who had dropped a pie in a field and changed everything by doing it. And that woman was Emma Bailey, who had once been Emma Holloway, who had carried a secret and a debt and 2 years of careful distance, and had come through all of it to this exact moment. In this exact field, with pie in her hands and love in full evidence all around her, she thought of her mother, who had taught her the recipe. She thought of Robert, who had called it the best thing about living on the frontier. She thought of the calf being returned, and the fence being fixed, and the irrigation water, and the Sunday mornings, and the coffee, and the crooked curtains, and the kitchen table arguments, and the children, and every harvest, every August, every pie. She thought of Charles watching her move through the field the first time and not looking away. Some things happen for the first time, and you only understand them looking back. You understand the whole weight of the beginning only once you have the full arc of what it became. And standing in the completed harvest field in the autumn of 1889, Emma Bailey understood completely. The pie had been an act of love even when she did not know it yet. The bringing of it, the making of it, the crossing of the fence line with it, the dropping of it. All of it had been her heart moving towards something she was telling herself not to want, and her heart had been right, and she had eventually had the sense to follow it. The evening settled over the Bailey farm. Charles came in from the field and lifted James off the ground, and James celebrated this by attempting to eat Charles's hat brim, which was a habit he had recently developed, and which produced commentary from everyone. Clara took Emma's hand, and William walked beside his father, and the harvest crew drifted toward the road, and old Pete Dawson finished his pie, and folded the cloth Emma had wrapped it in with the careful precision of a man who understands the value of things. They walked to the house together through the August twilight, Charles and Emma and their 3 children, and the door of the Bailey farmhouse opened to them, and the warmth of it came out into the cooling evening and wrapped around them all. And Emma stepped inside with her family behind her, and looked at the kitchen table set for supper, and the fire steady in the hearth, and the ledger books in the drawer, and the crooked curtains that were straight now, but which she sometimes remembered crooked because the memory of them had become part of the story. She had been a widow who brought pie to a harvest crew. She had dropped the pie. He had not stopped watching her. The rest of it, all the years and the seasons and the children and the harvests and the secrets resolved, and the love built daily and consistently and without reservation, the rest of it had simply been the full and astonishing consequence of those 3 facts. Emma Bailey stood in her kitchen and called her children in to supper, and Charles came to the sink to wash his hands and turned and looked at her from across the room with that expression, always that expression, and she looked back at him with everything she had and everything she was and everything they had made together. Outside, the Kansas night was settling in over the fields, and the stars were coming out one by one over the flat, dark land, and the wheat was harvested, and the family was fed, and the doors were locked against the night, and it was exactly enough, and it was everything.